So one of Nolan Wells' friends went back to the crime scene later on the night of the crime, according to the Coast Guard. Now the phases are saying he's in big trouble. What could Warren have been looking for? The disappearance of Nolan Wells has left behind a series of questions that become more complicated every time investigators revisit the timeline surrounding the boat trip. Among the most troubling questions is the allegation that Nolan's friend, Warren, returned to the area after Nolan disappeared and may have gone back toward the original scene. If investigators truly documented Warren returning to the location, the circumstances surrounding that return would naturally become an important part of the investigation. But there is a major distinction between someone returning to a location and someone deliberately removing or destroying evidence. Unless investigators have publicly established that Warren removed evidence, that conclusion remains an allegation rather than a proven fact. Still, the possibility raises questions that investigators would have to examine carefully. Why did Warren return? What did he know at the time? What did he believe had happened to Nolan? Who knew about his return? And perhaps most importantly, did anything disappear from the scene before authorities were able to fully process it? According to the scenario being examined, the Coast Guard's involvement becomes particularly important because the water surrounding the disappearance could contain evidence that would not necessarily remain in one place. Boats move, currents shift objects, weather changes conditions, and evidence can become extremely difficult to recover. That means investigators would have had to establish a detailed timeline, beginning with the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and continuing through the arrival of emergency personnel. Every person aboard the boat could potentially provide information about what happened before Nolan entered the water, what happened immediately afterward, and what occurred once authorities became involved. If Warren returned to the area during that critical window, investigators would want to know exactly where he went, how long he stayed, and whether he had access to anything connected to Nolan. The phrase, remove evidence, carries enormous implications. In a criminal investigation, evidence can include much more than a weapon or a physical object. It could include a phone, clothing, personal property, a life jacket, a piece of equipment, photographs, messages, fingerprints, biological material, or even something as seemingly insignificant as an object moved from its original position. Investigators therefore have to be extremely careful when reconstructing what a scene looked like before and after different people entered it. If an object was present during the initial emergency response, but later could not be located, investigators would need to determine whether it was removed, lost in the water, moved by the current, overlooked during the search, or simply misidentified. That is why Warren's alleged return would be significant without automatically proving wrongdoing. A person returning to a scene can have completely innocent explanations. Warren could have been looking for Nolan. He could have been trying to locate Nolan's belongings. He could have been attempting to help emergency personnel. He could have been confused, frightened, or simply trying to understand what had happened. On the other hand, investigators would also have to consider whether someone returning to a scene had an opportunity to alter its condition. The existence of an opportunity, however, does not prove that the opportunity was used. One of the biggest questions would be the exact timing. If Warren returned before the Coast Guard had secured the area, investigators would want to compare his movements against the emergency response timeline. When was Nolan reported missing? When did the Coast Guard arrive? When did the boat leave or become accessible? When did Warren allegedly return? Was anyone with him? Did he communicate with anyone before returning? Did he make calls or send messages afterward? Did surveillance footage, GPS information, phone location records, or witness statements place him at the scene? These details could potentially transform an ambiguous allegation into something investigators could evaluate objectively. The condition of the boat would also become relevant. If investigators believed the boat had been cleaned, rearranged, or otherwise altered after Nolan disappeared, they would have to determine when those changes occurred and who had access to the vessel. A boat involved in a disappearance can contain an enormous amount of information. Investigators might examine surfaces, compartments, personal belongings, safety equipment, navigation systems, electronic devices, and areas where Nolan was last known to be. They could also compare photographs taken before and after the incident. Even small inconsistencies can become important when investigators attempt to reconstruct a sequence of events. However, it would be dangerous to automatically interpret cleaning as proof of a cover-up. Boats are routinely cleaned, especially after being used on the water. The important question is not simply whether the boat was cleaned, but when, why, by whom, and what investigators found afterward. If cleaning occurred after a disappearance and before forensic processing, investigators could understandably want to know why. If it occurred as part of normal boat maintenance, before anyone realized Nolan was missing, that would be a different circumstance entirely. Warren's alleged return also raises the question of what he knew. Investigators often pay close attention to statements that change over time. If Warren initially described one sequence of events and later provided a substantially different version, detectives would likely compare both accounts against physical evidence, phone records, GPS data, witness testimony, and Coast Guard records. A changed statement does not automatically mean someone is lying. Traumatic events can affect memory, and people can remember details differently after having time to process what happened. But major contradictions involving critical events would naturally receive additional scrutiny. The same principle applies to Nolan's belongings. If something Nolan had with him before the incident later could not be located, investigators would need to establish when it was last seen. If a necklace, phone, clothing item, or other personal property disappeared, investigators could ask every person with access to the boat or surrounding area whether they saw it. If someone later possessed an item belonging to Nolan, the circumstances surrounding how that person obtained it could become extremely important. But again, missing property is not automatically proof that someone stole or intentionally removed it. Objects can disappear in water, become buried, drift away, or be recovered by someone who does not realize their importance. The Coast Guard's role in the investigation would therefore be centered on reconstructing what happened in the water and preserving information that could help determine Nolan's fate. Search crews would have to consider currents, tides, weather, visibility, water temperature, Nolan's last known location, and the possibility that his position changed after entering the water. Those factors can make a disappearance extraordinarily difficult to reconstruct. If an object was allegedly missing from the boat, investigators would have to determine whether it was removed from the vessel or whether it could have ended up in the water naturally. Perhaps the most important issue is the difference between suspicion and evidence. A documentary about Nolan Wells can explore why Warren's alleged return might raise questions, but responsible reporting must distinguish between what investigators have actually established and what people believe might have happened. If the Coast Guard has officially stated that Warren returned to the scene and that evidence was removed, that statement would need to be supported by an official report, court filing, press conference, or other reliable documentation. Without that documentation, the allegation should remain clearly identified as an allegation. That distinction matters because Nolan's family deserves answers based on facts rather than rumors. If Warren knows something important about Nolan's disappearance, investigators need him to provide a complete account. If he returned to the scene for an innocent reason, that explanation should be examined fairly. If investigators ultimately determine that someone deliberately altered the scene or removed evidence, that finding would carry much greater weight because it would be supported by physical evidence and documented investigative work. The unanswered questions surrounding Warren could therefore become one part of a much larger investigation. Detectives would need to examine phone records, location information, photographs, witness statements, Coast Guard records, boat records, forensic evidence, and the timeline of every person connected to the trip. They would need to determine exactly what happened before Nolan disappeared, what happened immediately afterward, and what happened during the hours that followed. Every movement would have to be placed on a timeline. Ultimately, the allegation that Warren returned to the scene and removed evidence cannot be treated as established fact without supporting evidence. But if investigators genuinely documented Warren returning to the area, that event would certainly deserve scrutiny. The key questions would be simple but powerful. Why did he return? What did he do when he got there? Who saw him? What was missing afterward? And can investigators prove that anything was intentionally removed? Those questions may ultimately determine whether Warren's return was simply the action of a frightened friend searching for answers, or something investigators believe requires much deeper examination. Until official evidence establishes otherwise, the responsible conclusion is not that Warren removed evidence, but that his alleged return, if confirmed, would be an important event in reconstructing the timeline of Nolan Wells's disappearance. The mystery is not solved by suspicion. It is solved by evidence, documentation, and a timeline that can withstand scrutiny.